So you have this absolutely tragic attack on Australian soil. But almost immediately, the story isn't just about grief. It's about anger. A firestorm of criticism erupts, and it's all pointed directly at the nation's leadership. We're going to break down this Sky News Australia report to really understand why the response to this tragedy was labeled by some as a catastrophic failure.
So what happened? Well, at the very heart of all of this was a terror attack. It targeted the Jewish community right in the middle of a Hanukkah celebration in Bondi. And it was just devastating. We're talking multiple fatalities, and the youngest victim was just a 10-year-old girl named Matilda.
So you have to wonder, right? How does the conversation after something so horrific pivot so fast to focus on the nation's leader? I mean, why was the Prime Minister suddenly being accused of failing not just the victims, but the entire country? That's really the big question this report is trying to answer.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the attack itself and that immediate, powerful accusation. Then, we'll dig into the specific criticisms aimed at the Prime Minister. After that, we'll zoom out to the bigger picture of ideology and immigration, put it all into the context of rising anti-Semitism, and then finally, we'll look at the calls for change that came out of all this.
All right, let's start with the one moment, the one deeply personal accusation that really set the tone for this whole firestorm.
This is just heartbreaking. It's what Matilda's father, Michael, said at her memorial. And that one sentence, it became a rallying cry. The report points to this as the moment that crystallized all the anger and, the sense of betrayal that so many critics of the government were feeling.
Okay, so how did that very personal grief spiral into a much broader critique of the Prime Minister's leadership? Let's get into it.
Well, the source lays out a bunch of specific complaints. For starters, critics felt the Prime Minister was deflecting, talking about gun laws when they wanted him to talk about ideology. They also said he was focusing too much on right-wing extremism, that he showed barely any emotion, and, this is a big one, that he seemed really reluctant to actually use the words radical Islam. All of this stuff just added fuel to the fire, and pretty soon there was a petition going around for him to resign.
And this quote from former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg really hits the nail on the head. He's basically saying, look, Prime Minister, if you can't even say the words Islamist ideology, how on earth are you supposed to solve the problem? For the people criticizing him, this wasn't just about picking the right words. It was about correctly identifying the threat.
And it wasn't just voices inside Australia either. The criticism went international. The report brings up commentators like the American politician Tulsi Gabbard, who didn't mince words. She drew a straight line from the attack right back to Australia's immigration policies, calling it a direct result of what she called a massive influx of Islamists. And that right there, that's the perfect lead-in to our next section, because this is where the source really connects the dots between this one attack and the huge, super contentious debate in Australia about national identity, immigration, and integration.
You can really see the disconnect here. On one side, you've got what the government was officially talking about, at least according to the report, things like gun laws, right-wing extremism, and new hate speech laws. But on the other side, that's what the critics were screaming about. They wanted to focus on radical Islamic ideology, on homegrown radicalization, and on what they saw as major flaws in the immigration system.
The report uses this quote from journalist Lehmann to kind of poke holes in the whole idea of Australian multiculturalism. Her argument, essentially, is that just because someone is born in Australia or gets a piece of paper saying they're a citizen, well, that doesn't magically erase their old beliefs or guarantee their loyalty. And she's arguing this attack is tragic proof of that flaw.
And they use the background of one of the alleged attackers as a perfect example. So get this. His father came to Australia on a student visa way back in 1998, and in over 25 years never became an Australian citizen. The son, the attacker, was born in Australia but was allegedly radicalized right there in southwest Sydney. For the critics, this wasn't some one-off thing. It was Exhibit A of a system that was failing.
And this is so important to understand. According to the source, this attack didn't just happen out of the blue. It's framed as the terrifying peak of a rising wave of anti-Semitism that had been building across the country.
And look at this number, it's just staggering. The report points to data from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and it shows that anti-Semitic incidents have jumped by almost 5 times. 5 times! It paints this picture of a community that's been feeling more and more under siege.
And we're not just talking about abstract numbers here. The report lists off some really disturbing, concrete examples. You had a Jewish bakery that was basically harassed until it had to close. Another Jewish-owned business got targeted with a flood of 1-star reviews.
And then, of course, there were those infamous protests outside the Sydney Opera House, with people chanting, "Gas the Jews." All these things are used to show this wasn't happening in the shadows, it was out in the open, and the climate was getting way more hostile.
So, okay, with all this public anger and this horrific attack, the conversation naturally turned to, what do we do now? And that brings us to our final section, where we're going to look at what the government put on the table versus what its critics were demanding.
All right, so the government came out with a 5-point plan. It was very focused on legal stuff, cracking down on the rhetoric. They talked about creating a new offense for preachers who promote violence, jacking up the penalties for hate speech, making hate a factor in sentencing, and creating a list of official hate organizations.
But for the critics featured in the Sky News report, yeah, that plan didn't go nearly far enough. They wanted much tougher action. They were talking about deporting any non-citizen hate preachers, overhauling the Migration Act to be way stricter about screening, and just flat-out canceling the visas of anyone with extremist leanings. They even called for banning pro-Palestine protests, which they described as incubators of hate.
And to really drive home how serious they felt this was, the report includes this quote from Mia Schlick. She calls the Bondi attack Australia's 9/11. Now, when you use a phrase like that, you're not just saying it's a tragedy. You're saying it's a game changer, an event that should force a complete reevaluation of everything, from national security to social policy.
And that's where this report leaves us, really, with this very stark, very urgent question. The whole argument is that Australia is at a major crossroads, and it suggests that if big, serious changes aren't made, the country could be heading for a future with even deeper divisions and, terrifyingly, even more violence.